All right, let's see what V. Gordon Childe described as characteristics of ancient civilizations. Okay, one important characteristic was size and density. So, not just a large sprawling village, but there usually is some sort of population density. Now, again, an exception to this rule is some of the ancient societies they're finding now in the Amazon, where you have these kind of sprawling communities where things are not dense, but settlements are spread far and wide and connected by these kind of simple roads. And to many people, they look like cities, but cities not in the same way that Mesopotamian cities developed. Okay, some sort of specialization of labor. So we start to see more and more people who work on a craft, people specialize in other things. And this leads to developments in technology. Surplus, right? So tribute that's kind of called up either through ritual or given to, let's say, the religious area. Social stratification. So maybe is there a nobility or ruling class, military elites possibly, political elites, right? Organization. So this doesn't necessarily apply to all these civilizations. And even the Mesopotamia, there's some debate around this. But Childe and others thought that membership to the city-state, right, or to the nation, or to the civilization or culture, or what have you, was more important than kinship. Right? Again, what we'll see is that a lot of times, and we'll see this with the temple is the same layout as the tripartite house, and so in many respects, the idea of the household was enlarged to incorporate the city. Monumental architecture, long distance trade, monumental artwork, writing doesn't exist in every civilization, but it does develop in Mesopotamia, as we'll see. And then eventually sciences like arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, right? So state societies are typically highly centralized. And there's political centralization. More people have more power, or a fewer number of people have a greater amount of power. There's also stratification. And in general, states have a monopoly of force, right? That is, the state has more power militarily than, let's say, any of the groups within the society. Not every state had warfare, though, large amounts of warfare, and not every state used coercion. There's different ways or different forms of power in these different societies. So within chiefdoms, right, you have, the chiefs, and within states, you typically have something like a king, or as we'll see in the Indus civilization, when compared to Mesopotamia, you have more of like a group leadership. Cities tend to only exist in states. So what's good evidence for a state? That is, when do you know in Mesopotamia when the states actually appear? Well, when you have these large monuments in a very large site, when you have wealth differences that are even greater than in chiefdoms, rich child burials, maybe even something like a royal burial, when you have evidence of control and administration, sometimes evidence of that in Mesopotamia takes the form of these cylinder seals. We're going to see more of this, but and talk about why you seal things. But this is a piece of stone carved with an image rolled onto a piece of clay. It creates this seal. These typically were used to show ownership or to maintain control of things. More specialization would be evidence of the state, right? So more craft production that you'd see in, let's say, an agricultural society or purely agricultural society. You would see different distribution of artifacts. You would also see different size sites. So you'd have, let's say, 4 levels of sites rather than just two levels of sites that you'd have in a chiefdom: large village, small village. In a state, you would have cities, you would have, let's say, maybe a large town, you would have large villages, and then you'd have small villages and maybe even very tiny hamlets. So why do some chiefdoms evolve in the states? This is not inevitable. Not all chiefdoms evolved in the states. There has to be some sort of driving force, we think, for chiefdoms to then become states. And it's not just populations getting bigger. As we'll see with Mesopotamia, there is a population increase, but it's not uniform all over lower Mesopotamia, right? So it's not just that societies got bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they formed states. So different anthropologists have proposed several theories to try and explain why chiefdoms became states. We're going to look at a few of them. Then we're going to look at the earliest state in Mesopotamia. And then we're going to look at maybe trying to explain the state in Mesopotamia. Okay, so one of the first ideas to kind of be laid out, it was in the 1920s. A guy named Karl Wittfogel studied ancient China, compared China to some of these other civilizations, saw that many civilizations appear on rivers. So he proposed the idea that many of these early civilizations eventually needed irrigation to survive. And here you can see some early irrigation here. Now, this requires a large labor force, but also requires organization. You can't just get several hundred people together and say, go build a large-scale irrigation system, because it also has to be maintained. Because if that irrigation system is not maintained, it will fill up and clog up with silt, which is the particles within the river sediment, and it won't function anymore. So in order to have irrigation, you have to have leadership, and you have to have bureaucracy and management, and workers have to be paid, and that essentially is the state. And so according to Wittfogel, the need for large-scale irrigation creates a need for organization, and that need is satisfied by the creation of what we would call a state. So according to Wittfogel, large-scale irrigation appears around the same time as the state. They've tested this in different areas of the world. Now, how would you test it? Well, you would want to see evidence for large-scale irrigation appearing around the time that the state is emerging. What did they find in Mesopotamia? Well, what they found in Mesopotamia was small-scale irrigation that would not require any kind of leadership from the top to organize coming first, then the development of the state, and then only later on is large-scale irrigation organized from the top. Does that appear actually in Mesopotamia? So Wittfogel's hypothesis does not explain the origins of the state in Mesopotamia, because the state appears first, large-scale irrigation appears later. They needed to irrigate, yes, to survive, but it was irrigation that was done on a community-by-community level, did not require leadership from the top. Okay, so that doesn't explain it. Other people tried other ideas for other civilizations and Mesopotamia as well. So another theory is what's called population growth in a circumscribed environment. And this was proposed by a guy named Carnero. And he said, imagine a scenario where you have different villages and towns that grow up in these areas that are circumscribed. That is, they're bound by desert or mountains. And so there's only so far they can spread out. It's only so far their agricultural system can spread, even with irrigation, right? Because they hit up against desert. At a certain point, their population is going to get bigger than the amount of food they're producing. And this is going to create a crisis. Now, what's going to happen? Well, there's lots of different possibilities of what could happen. People could limit their population. People could move. According to Carnero, though, what would happen is conflict with other villages. Now, when we think of warfare, we tend not to think of cooperation. Warfare is not cooperative. However, if you think of it in a certain way, it is actually cooperative. It's cooperative within groups, not between groups, but within groups. And the more organized you are within your group, the more success you're going to have in warfare, which means that you're going to be able to conquer other places. You're going to have another hierarchy developing. Let's say you organize your society into a military leader and other leaders to go conquer another area. You conquer that area, and now you have the conquerors and the conquered. That sets up even greater hierarchy. And out of this emerges the state. Right? So according to Carnero, warfare led to the rise of the state. That is, the warfare emerged because of conflict over resources. Organization was favored, and it also there was an impetus to develop greater organization because that would lead to more success in warfare. Once conquest starts, this, along with the organization, leads to centralized organization or the state. Okay, for Mesopotamia, we'll talk about this. What you would need in order to show that this was correct for your society is you would have to see population growth, then you'd have to see intensive warfare emerging around the same time that you have the state. So we are going to see if this actually holds up for Mesopotamia or not. All right. Another theory deals with long-distance trade. We're going to see this with Mesopotamia as well. That is, why would long-distance trade or the need for long-distance trade lead to the state? Well, if you're trading over long distances, in order to trade, you need to produce something. That requires organization. In order for merchants to go long distances and set up colonies to trade with local people, you need organization. And this leads to the need to have greater administration, bureaucracy, leadership, basically the state. So that's another idea. But as you see with a lot of these ideas is that they're focused on one thing, right? Irrigation or warfare or trade. And as you would expect, with many civilizations, it's not necessarily just one, as archaeologists call them, prime mover, right? Or one main cause. It could be a combination of different things. Let's look at a Marxist perspective. When you apply the ideas of Marx, you're essentially saying that the economy will structure other aspects of the society. Right? And Marx wrote about ancient societies as well. So what would Marx and other Marxists say about these ancient societies? Well, Marx talks a lot about class conflict, haves and have-nots. According to Marxists, the state emerges as a way for the haves to keep their wealth and make it permanent and create permanent classes, right? And have a way of justifying it to the have-nots or the have-lesses, right? And an example of this might be ancient Egypt, right? So in ancient Egypt, the ideology at the time was that the pharaoh was considered to be a king, but was also considered to be a god, right? And we're talking about a literal god on earth. Now, a Marxist would say, well, that is a ideology and a religious belief that is pretty convenient for the leaders, especially the pharaoh. It's doubtful that would just sort of emerge on its own. That was probably created by the leaders in order to make their hierarchy and their hierarchical status within the society permanent. Right? That's what a Marxist might say, that ideology is used to create these permanent differences, and the state is essentially a way of cementing these differences. Now, these ideas are very hard to test archaeologically. Very, very difficult. We can't get inside people's minds, right? We see ideology developing, but why did it develop? Maybe it does serve the elites or the status quo, but does that mean that it was consciously invented? Very difficult to say, right? So, but this is kind of a Marxist idea that you have kind of, differences in wealth, differences in status, that leads to class conflict, and that leads to the state. All right. After these ideas, more and more people started to propose multiple causes. Right? So another idea, this one was applied to Mesopotamia, and we'll talk about how well this might apply, is that states emerged because larger societies were kind of a benefit or an adaptation to a certain kind of environment. Right? So by kind of sticking together, they were more likely to survive than by being in smaller separate communities, right? If they pool their resources like into one large temple where they store surplus food, they're more likely to survive in a certain kind of environment where there might be want and there might be starvation than, let's say, some of these smaller scale communities. That's another idea. And we'll look at that in Mesopotamia as well, right? Okay. So here's kind of that Adams model, right? Wealth concentration, but it's used to support the large majority of the population. So rather than keeping wealth differences permanent, it's sort of like a almost quote unquote welfare state, right? That is, socialized quote unquote state. That is, the state will support people in times of want and in bad times. Okay, final one we'll look at is the idea of systems theory. Systems theory was proposed by these two guys, Flannery and Henry Wright, who said it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. Right? Civilizations work like a system. There's inputs, there's outputs. So it could be partially warfare, population, irrigation, trade, class conflict, right? All those things might play a role in the emergence of a civilization depending on where you are. And so different inputs or factors are going to be important in different civilizations, and you can't just have a one-size-fits-all theory. Basically saying it's complicated and there are multiple causes for the development of civilization. Right? As we look at states, we also have to keep in mind the idea of cultural hegemony, right? Cultural hegemony is the domination of a culturally diverse society by maybe one subset, could be the ruling class, who impose a dominant ideology on the majority of the population. Right? So sort of ideas becoming dominant over other ideas. This is the idea of cultural hegemony, and it sometimes occurs, or maybe we could identify it in different civilizations. But on the flip side is also agency, personal human choice, and resistance. That is, did the majority of the population just accept what was being handed out to them by the leaders in terms of ideas, or did they actually push back against some of these ideas? We'll see in Mesopotamia, you did have popular revolts in its history. Okay, so now let's take a look at the very earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia. Okay, in the Neolithic, many different areas of the Near East kind of develop along the same lines. We see, similar, large-sized villages in Jericho and Ain Ghazal, but also, in the Levant, and then also in Anatolia at Çatalhöyük. Then we start to see larger communities develop in northern Mesopotamia with the Halaf, But we don't really see that many clear differences between the different areas of the Near East until we really get to the Uruk period. And during the Uruk period, southern Mesopotamia really takes off in terms of development and in terms of the size of the population. And it really is distinct from the other areas of Mesopotamia, as we're going to see. Even though one of the articles you're going to read talks about northern Mesopotamia and how cities were developing in northern Mesopotamia around the same time. There's still a little bit of debate about that, as you'll see. Okay, we talked about constraints and opportunities, and southern Mesopotamia has some important opportunities. One, very fertile soil. Two, the Tigris and Euphrates, the marshes, but also the canals and tributaries that connect the Tigris and Euphrates together. Now, what don't they have? They don't have any rainfall, which means that they have to irrigate. But it turns out that if you irrigate in southern Mesopotamia, you have a more productive area than any other place in the Near East. More productive than northern Mesopotamia, the Levant, or Anatolia. What else did they not have in southern Mesopotamia? It was mainly flat, silty soil. They did not have many trees, they did not have any stone, and they did not have any metal. So, as we kind of talked about, it was this combination of constraints and opportunities that might have propelled Mesopotamian civilization along. They were able to feed a large population. They were able to create surplus. They could use that surplus to support craft specialists and workers and people like that. But they did not have things that many of the people wanted, especially the emerging leaders or elites: metals, things made out of stone, things made out of wood. They needed wood for roof beams and things like that. Okay, you can see some of the simple irrigation that still occurs in southern Iraq today, in southern Mesopotamia. Now, during the Rook period, the period right after the Ubaid, the marshes decrease a little bit. They pull back. And that actually allows for more arable or more farmland for irrigation. Okay, here you can see a historic photo from Iraq, and you can see some of those irrigation canals. And you can see the way that they're built. Again, the earliest irrigation in Mesopotamia, even in the Uruk period, was small scale. All right, when you compare northern Mesopotamia, which is rain-fed Mesopotamia, with southern Mesopotamia, right, what you're going to see, and what you see here, this is southern Mesopotamia specifically looking at a city, the first city in the world that we're going to explore today, the city of Vorka, that's the Arabic name, also called Uruk in ancient Mesopotamian. That's where the period gets its name from. What you see is during this Uruk period, the population of that city increases exponentially, right? It really takes off. Another southern Mesopotamian city kind of increases and decreases a little bit, but this is not quite a huge city. This is one of Nippur, as you know, we'll talk later in the semester. The city of Uruk is really taking off. At the same time, in northern Mesopotamia, the population kind of increases. Then it plateaus and then starts to decrease towards the end of the Uruk period. Now, as we'll see, some people think that cities were actually emerging in northern Mesopotamia first, slightly earlier, by a couple hundred years, than in southern Mesopotamia. All right, what are some of the other advantages besides agriculture? Well, the network of rivers and canals was really excellent for transportation. And in most civilizations, ancient people could not really transport food very easily because food is very bulky and transportation was typically, kind of expensive. But with Mesopotamia, with southern Mesopotamia, all these villages were connected via water. And water still is the best way to transport goods. 85% of our goods today come by boat. It's cheap, it's affordable, and you can carry a lot. And we have these impressions from Rook cylinder seals showing transportation by boat. Again, even today, when they're transporting material from China, it'll be loaded into one of those, tractor trailer cargo holds, placed on a transport ship, and then sent to the United States. It will take a few weeks to get here, but it's much cheaper than trying to fly it over here. Okay, with these rivers, you could use a sail, or you could just use punting or paddling. This is a reed boat that's been waterproofed with that petroleum tar. You can see some watermelons in there. This is a historic photo from Iraq. Here's another one. You can see them carrying quite a lot of goods in one of these. They're called kufas. They had other kinds of these longer boats you can see here that they used in the marshes. So lots of connectivity. They could pull barges upstream, and then the boats could move downstream. Now, in other parts of Mesopotamia, you could use the rivers somewhat, but you didn't have all these networks of canals like you did in southern Mesopotamia. And so only around the next period, so not even at this period, but in the next period, you have donkeys, which could actually be used to transport goods. Otherwise, they had to be transported by human porter. Humans had to carry them. Right? And even with a donkey, there's a limit to how much you can carry. And so it's much more expensive in terms of what you're going to get back and the investment you put into transportation. All right. Well, what do we have the Mesopotamians to thank for? Well, a lot of the earliest things in history that we associate with quote-unquote civilization appear in Mesopotamia first before any other areas in the world. Egypt is a close second with many of these things, but Mesopotamia can boast the earliest cities in the world, the earliest states, which go along with cities, the earliest writing we'll talk about, although Egypt is a debate about which came first, Egyptian or Mesopotamian writing. Probably Mesopotamian by a few hundred years. The first organized warfare, the first wheel, the first kings, the first colonial trading system. We'll talk more about that. Not the first trade, right, which you can trade to one village, that village can trade to the next village, and so on. We're talking about setting up sites specifically as trading colonies. The first scientific evidence for beer. Right? And if you've ever seen that movie, The Life of Brian, where they have a scene, what have the Romans ever done for us? I kind of paraphrase that, what have the Mesopotamians ever done for us? Right? Roots of civilization. Okay, during the Rook period, most of our information about the period comes from the site of a Rook, and only one portion of the site that has Rook levels exposed, and then areas outside of Mesopotamia, these trading colonies, which I worked on when I was a graduate student. I worked at one of these Mesopotamian trading colonies, and I'll talk more about that. Okay, a Rook is located here in southern Mesopotamia. Around this time, again, the marshes start to retreat a little bit, leaving arable land, but you still have all these network of canals. Here's a Rook over here, canals connecting different parts, making transportation much, much easier. Okay, the site of Vorka in Arabic is the ancient city of Uruk. Uruk is mentioned in the Bible as Erech. It talks about Nimrod, the hunter, in Genesis, and it talks about Erech. It was, at its height, one of the largest cities in the ancient world, and really one of the largest cities in the ancient world throughout history. Now, because Uruk is a tell, it means that in some parts of the site there are things that cover up the Uruk levels. Now, how do you actually figure out if a site has Uruk levels to begin with? Let's say you're doing survey, you go to a tell. how can you figure out that there's Uruk material there without even digging? From the pottery, right? There's enough rainfall and disturbance and sometimes even plowing that pottery that's buried underneath will come to the surface. So by surveying the entire site and also the areas around on the edge of the mound, you could tell if there's a Rook pottery there, and you could tell how big approximately the Rook settlement might have been. In this case, the Rook period's area of the city was about this area. And then by the later period, the early dynastic that we'll see, you had a city wall surrounding the entire city. There are two main areas that archaeologists excavated in. These were German archaeologists from the 1900s. Really, they're redoing excavations today. The areas in the middle did not have later occupation after the Uruk, so it was easy to get to those Uruk levels. In other parts of the site, if they wanted to get to them, they might have to dig through a lot of other material. Now, the ancient city of Uruk had a tributary or a canal connected to the Euphrates that ran right through the center of the city. That would have made transportation in the city pretty easy. It looks like, based on the archaeology, that Uruk might have actually started out as two separate large villages, one centered kind of here and the other centered here, that grew into one major city. The material from this center is what we're going to look at from these important public buildings in the center of the city, and they date to around 3200 BC. So we're talking about over 5,000 years ago. Okay, in the early middle Uruk period, that's what EM stands for, the site was about 70 to 100 hectares. A hectare, again, is 2 football fields. So we're talking about 140 to 200 football fields put together. By the late Uruk period, it was 250 hectares, or 500 football fields, and possibly a population of 50,000 people. This is unheard of for the time period. Right? The time period, people are living in, most of the areas of the world are living in, villages of several hundred, maybe even a couple of thousand, but not 50,000 people in a 250 hectare city. Now, what would that look like today? If you took the entire ring of Uruk, 500 football fields, and you plopped it down on our campus, one end would be here by the softball fields, the other end at the opposite end, all the way through all those ravines to at the end of the river. Right, so very large area. If you walk this, that would take you a good half hour, maybe more. What about the downtown campus? It would go from, the DeVos building all the way up to like the Medical Mile area. So and it was densely occupied. That's another thing that you guys are going to read about is, these cities, as you can imagine, these ancient cities with lots of people packed into them, were hotbeds for disease. All sorts of disease would have been transmitted because people were living right on top of each other and also generating waste. Okay, so we're talking about a very large city. This would, again, if you walk this, it would take you a good half hour to walk from one end to the other. Well, let me show you another picture so you get an idea of the scale that we're talking about. This is a city in northern Iraq today. It's called Erbil. You can see this is a tell. This is the ancient part of the city of Erbil. Here's the modern part of Erbil. That has a medieval wall surrounding the old part on the tell. This is what it looks like from street level. Now, if you plopped Uruk, you get sort of a sense of scale here. If you plopped Uruk on top of that, here's that tell of Erbil, and here is Uruk. If you compare Uruk to some other cities from the ancient world, you can see that Uruk, during the end, when it had that big wall around it, was bigger than Athens during the time of war with the Persian Empire, and it was bigger than Jerusalem during the time of Jesus, and it was almost as big as Rome during the height of Rome. Okay, now the two central areas that were excavated by the archaeologists, one, we have an idea of maybe the gods that they were associated with because of later artifacts that were found there. But there's one area that's dedicated to Anu, and there's another area dedicated to Inanna called the Eanna precinct. We'll talk about what these names actually mean. But let's first look at the area of Anu and the first ziggurat.